Hi there, my name's Melissa Terras. I'm a professor at the University of Edinburgh where I am today, or rather I'm in my cupboard where I've been for the past 2 years for obvious reasons. I hope you're doing all okay at the other side of the world. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there to join you in Melbourne. I hope you're having a fantastic conference, and thanks so much for the invitation to talk to you today about my research passion, which is digitisation and the act of making copies of cultural heritage, how we do that, how we best do it at scale across the sector, and what we can do with it after. I'm going to talk today about digitisation and how it relates to research in what we call digital humanities, the use of computing to study the past, but really stressing the importance of the digital humanities community to engage with cultural heritage digitisation, to work with library and information professionals and those in the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, archives, museums, to try and make sure that the digital cultural heritage collections that we're making are as inclusive and beneficial as possible to everyone. I wish I was there with you, but I'm going to hit record now and actually put up my slides, so just bear with me a minute while I share my screen. This is always the embarrassing bit where it takes so long to figure out the tech. I'm going to put it into presentation mode, and then I'll make sure that I'm as large as possible in the video. There we go, and we should be good to go. So, digital humanities and GLAM digitisation, the need to build a virtuous circle. I'm going to argue here today that the relationship between digital humanities and digitisation within galleries, libraries, archives, museums, I'm going to use that term GLAM quite a lot for a shortcut. Although there's been mass digitisation of GLAM since the 1990s, and the process is pretty much known now, we know how to do it well. Digital humanities, the study of the past using tech, uses the products of this process for teaching, for research, for engagement online. But we really need to understand the digitisation process to help create inclusive digital GLAM collections that we can use, and that also influences our research. So I'm going to briefly cover the history of digitisation in the GLAM sector, which will not be news to a lot of you, but I just thought it would be worth recapping a couple of slides on that. I'm going to then look at how digital humanities uses GLAM digitised materials for teaching and research and engagement. I'm going to ask how digital humanities people can engage more with the digitisation process, giving some core examples about testing new technologies, selecting items for digitisation, analysing the legal and policy frameworks which exist, for example, copyright, but also IPR. I'm going to talk about how we can analyse whole collections at scale using collections as data, and think a little bit about engagement, social media, and teaching as well as research. The core point of this is that the digital humanities, libraries, archives, museums, galleries, we need to work together on digitisation. And after I've gone through all that, I'll just give a few slides about what we're doing at the University of Edinburgh at the moment in this space, to give you some ideas about how we're trying to build an inclusive digital cultural heritage environment here. So, brief history of the digitisation of cultural heritage. I'm sure most of you know that digitisation really began in the 1970s with databases. This was people trying to make sure that the records of the collections were stored computationally as databases for collections management. Now, a lot of the things which you see online now are these internal databases which have been flipped to be externally facing. And it wasn't until the 1980s and early 1990s that images started to be put alongside these metadata records. The cost of digitisation of or creating images meant that in the 1980s it was only important treasures that actually had images taken of them, such as the Beowulf manuscript here from the British Library. Mass digitisation happened from the 1990s because of the internet, because the cost of computing came down, and because the cost of digital cameras came down. Nowadays, users expect everything to be digitised, and that, of course, has been exacerbated by the pandemic. A study last year showed that 86% of museums in the UK had increased their digital activity over the pandemic, especially now that access can only be done remotely. It's hard to understand the whole scope of digitisation internationally. The last kind of overarching study on this that came out that kind of covers a large geographical area was in 2017 when the EU produced their Enumerate report, which showed that 82% of GLAM institutions now have a digital collection, but only 58% of the collections are catalogued digitally. Only 22% of the collections have been digitally reproduced, and 40% of those are not available online. In total, more than half of institutions still need to be reproduced or captured, and only half of the institutions surveyed are actually looking at how their digital collections are being used. So there's a huge amount of work to do to still digitise cultural heritage and understand how best to do it. So the take home from this is that only a fraction of the world's collections are digitised, and this is after 30 concerted years of effort and expense in digitising cultural heritage. And the funding for this has changed massively. Across the European Union in the 2000s, there was a lot of money available for digitisation. That's no longer the case. Institutions are expected to pay for digitisation themselves. Capture takes time, it is resource intensive, it is very costly. As a result, people are very expensive to employ. And we also need, as well as taking captures, you will understand that we need cataloguing, we need description, we need to then look after those digital assets through storage and digital preservation. All of this needs resources. And then we have the question, how best should we deliver these materials to users? The good thing is we're so far along the process now that there are 30 years of guidelines behind us. So that most of you will be familiar with the FADGI guidelines, which is how best to start doing a mass digitisation project. So a lot of the basics have been sorted out. But here we are now in the 2020s at the end of a huge amount of investment with millions of items that are online, a lot of mass digitised content and all kinds of different medias, lots of reuse conditions and licensing. Some major aggregators have come together, such as Europeana and Google Arts and Culture. I'll talk about them in a little minute, as well as individual institutions and individual people having their own digitised cultural heritage collections as well. There's a whole amateur digitisation collecting environment out there online too, which spreads over Flickr and Tumblr and all these social media sites. And then we have to think about how we can process all of that data. There's a very recent movement called collections as data, which is can basically be summed up as don't give me one individual image from something, give me your whole data set, allow me to take the whole thing and process it. And from a digital humanities or information studies point of view, that is a really key development. Give me an entire library catalogue and anything you've got digitised so that I can run fairly complex searches over that. And that's been a big change about how we deliver that massive data to people. So what about the digital humanities? The digital humanities as a field have been around since the 1980s, although it only became called digital humanities over the past decade or 15 years. How does digital humanities trying to use tech to understand the past? How does it use digitized GLAM content? Well, it needs machine processable data. Most of the data that we get is from institutional contexts. You can digitize stuff yourself, and that's really costly and time consuming. There are text mining exceptions which allow you to do that under EU, UK, US frameworks. The rest of the world, not so sure about, it's very dependent. But if you're going to digitize it yourself, it's so time consuming. As a result, most digital humanities projects depend on openly licensed or data they can get their hands on from libraries, archives and museums. And we reuse that content. We reuse the available content. We do large scale text and data mining. For example, this is a graph here of Jeremy Bentham's writings, and we did topic modeling to figure out what the themes were that he was writing about in his manuscripts. Or we build digital editions where we have images and transcripts and we explain what the background to crucial texts were. We can see how resources are used. We look at use patterns and use cases. We can build platforms for co-creation, so taking the digital images or digital text and doing something else with it. But as a result, because we're dependent on the GLAM content, digitization selection directs digital humanities project direction. If things aren't digitized, we can't do the large scale projects. without actually making sure we have the resources to digitize stuff ourselves. As a result, selection choices that are made within GLAM help choose what we can study. And digitisation is a bottleneck for a lot of digital humanities activity. I mentioned the Jeremy Bentham manuscripts at University College London, where I was previous to Edinburgh. We digitised them all. This is Tony Slade digitising them. We then put them online. We then built, if I can forward my slides, which I've stopped forwarding, there we go, for unknown reasons, I'll just skip back. We can then build an infrastructure on top of that to help people transcribe them. So we used Wikimedia to build a wiki where we put up images of manuscripts that had never been read before, and we got volunteers to transcribe them. We've now done half of the 50,000 images that are in UCL collections. And then you have the data, and then you can analyze it, and then you can do topic modeling, then you can do machine learning, then you can do all the stuff that we want to do in natural language processing and stuff to actually understand more about the person who has written all these documents in the first place. Now, just trying to see if my PowerPoint will go forward. There we go. Why should digital humanities then care about digitisation? Digitisation selection can direct the digital humanities project direction because we're dependent on having these digitised content in the first place, and it can affect what research is possible. It is a bottleneck for activity. So digital humanities community should be engaging with librarians, with archivists about what they're choosing to digitise. But why should libraries care about the digital humanities community and what they can research? Well, we can help test new technologies, and I'm going to go through all of these in greater detail, by the way. We can help test new technologies. We can help select items for digitisation. We can help with analysis of legal and policy frameworks, for example, copyright or IPR. We can help with analysis of collections at scale, this idea of taking a whole database and actually doing something with it. We can help look at and understand engagement online, including social media, so making sure that we can develop best practice to choose how or to help steer our scant resources. And a lot of resources across libraries, archives and museums have been affected over the past 10 years of austerity, but also because of the pandemic. We have to choose what we're doing and how we do it with best practice. We can also use digital resources in teaching, and also we can do more active research with them and research into the process. So I'm going to go through all of these individually and talk about that relationship with libraries and digital humanities and where the sweet spot is about these different things. So the first one is about testing new digitisation technologies. Digitisation technologies are always changing. If we think back to, 2008, there weren't even iPhones around. So it's difficult as a sector to keep up with the level of change. Even though we understand how best practice is running out for the majority of digitisation and how you would get, your books digitised or your manuscripts digitised, there's always going to be individual formats that need research, but there's also new technologies which are being developed, mostly in the medical sciences for imaging, that we can drag over to the library sciences and test them out and say, well, how is that working, or how will that work for people? And when you do that, you need time to do research, to do trials and error, and then you publish your research and then you publish best practice on it. What I'm showing you there is two images of a before and after of a Leonardo da Vinci drawing, which is in the Historic Royal Palaces collection at Windsor, so with the Queen. And on that side, the left-hand side, you've got a picture of the horses, and that's what the human eye can see. This is Silver Point. It's deteriorated. There's lots of blank pages in the collection. They don't know what's on them. They don't know if anything was drawn on them. Can we image them in any way that the human eye would be able to see it? So we imaged it using multispectral technology, and then we did image processing, which pulls out the image on the right, which are the images that you just couldn't see with the human eye. This is a type of technology, advanced capture and processing for multispectral imaging, hyperspectral imaging. It's still quite nascent within the cultural heritage sector, still quite expensive. We're about at that stage where it's going to become easier to use, simpler to use, and cheaper to use, but we have to know when it works and when it doesn't to be able to deploy it efficiently across collections. So we've been working on that for the past couple of years. Other live areas of research, artificial intelligence and machine learning, for example, handwritten text recognition. I work a lot on a project called Transcribus, which is about generating accurate transcriptions of text from images. And we're getting 96, 98, 99% accuracy, depending on the source now. That was an EU-funded project for 10 years. We've now spun out into a company, so and we've been 2 years without funding. We're washing our own face, as they would say in the UK. We've got enough funding to pay to keep the servers on and to keep the service going. It is a subscription service now, but not a terribly high cost one. So we're engaging with a lot of libraries, archives, museums throughout the world who are helping keep this infrastructure alive. And we are now able to generate lots of transcripts of text, which is really important for doing any of the other kind of analysis you want to cover after it. Another important thing is IIIF and interoperability. So IIIF is a standard image, international image interaction framework. It's about making sure that you deliver images in a way where the high quality image is always looked after by the institution, but accessible from a technical perspective through others. And people can always draw down on that image to get the thumbnail they want or the high resolution image they want, and make sure that we look after the quality of images which is flying around online. So there's a canonical image which is delivered by the institution. This is still really technical to get set up and to understand how best to do it. I'm working on a project just now with the National Gallery in London as part of the Towards a National Collection project from the UK to see how we can explain IIIF better. I'm aware I didn't do it so well just 2 seconds ago. And also make sure that people can adopt it to, once they've captured images, they can actually share it better. Then we have the issue of persistent identifiers. Images have a habit of wandering around online without anyone being able to say where they're from. How do we begin to build an infrastructure so that we can share digitized cultural heritage so people know where it's from? The amount of misinformation about images, where they're from, who they belong to, is huge. We did a study a couple of years ago about where images go when they're put online. And we looked at one particular room from the National Gallery in London and where the images all went. And they were everywhere from, you know, the front cover of books and CDs and stuff, and on Wikipedia, illegally, because they hadn't been licensed for reuse. But when they were on Wikipedia, the people said that they were from the Tate Gallery in London. So, you know, things like that, where you can't control where things go. How do we make sure that there are persistent identifiers so people can actually put this stuff out with confidence and actually users can actually understand where these images were from in the first place? Then we have audience engagement. How do we engage with an audience, and how do we make sure that we are using these resources, which take time to actually create, take time to do well, make sure that we are using them best. So a huge amount of work to do in that, but also with these new technologies. How do we make sure that they understand the new technologies and the ever-changing technological environment? There's also ethical issues about capture technologies. Just because we can capture things, just because the tech works, doesn't mean it's A, legal to do that, or B, ethical. There's a difference between legal and ethical, and making sure that we're deploying our resources in a way which is supportive, especially to minority communities. So there's questions about how best we can deploy this tech to build more diverse collections. It's expensive to experiment and expensive to play with this type of stuff. So the Digital Humanities can help with that and help navigate with that. And there are huge areas there for collaboration for Digital Humanities researchers, plus library and information science colleagues, plus our GLAM sector colleagues as well. Moving on to how Digital Humanities can help look at selecting items for digitisation. Understanding why and how and where collections have been chosen to be digitised is really important, and there's quite a lot of work done now on the politics of digitisation, and anyone who thinks that digitisation choices are not political needs to have a look at some of the things which are happening. For example, in the UK, it's likely that we're coming out of Europeana, which is the EU aggregator. We are now building a national collection, and I'm part of a couple of those projects. But at the same time, my alarm bells are ringing about the jingoistic nature of this. We need to be careful that we're looking at the politics around digital cultural heritage and how it can be used in ways to support certain ideologies. It's up to researchers to research and investigate this and ask these difficult questions of these communities, and ask these difficult questions of the fundings and the structures which allow things to be digitised. Because the choices made in what is a part of the national collection in the UK will affect what research questions we can ask and will affect what outputs people can make. There was a bid that went into the National Collection which was looking at the legacies of slavery. That did not get funded. So that stuff's not getting digitised. So we can't interrogate it, and we can't do text and data mining. I will leave my thoughts there because I'm aware I'm being recorded. But Digital Humanities can work with GLAM institutions to make inclusive recommendations regarding choice and what we're choosing to digitise and the ramifications that will have on what we can digitise. And selection biases really matter. This is from a paper I published about a year and a half ago about Google Arts and Culture. And we scraped the whole of Google Arts and Culture at the time, and we looked at where the institutions were that appeared on Google Arts and Culture. And the digitised collections which appear on Google Arts and Culture, which says it's an open door to the world's cultural heritage. Look at the proportion of museums in the US, 310,000, compared to the number of institutions that have got content from Africa. Let's just think for a minute about that, and think for a minute about whether this aggregator has done enough homework to ensure that a diverse lot of institutions, voices, cultures, heritages are being promoted through this platform. I think the map speaks for itself there. So we need to really analyse this information which is coming out of digitisation, but we also need to poke a stick at the legal and policy frameworks which make us get there. And this is ripe for research in the digital humanities, because copyright also decides digitisation. When you look at digitisation practices, we have what we would call a 20th century black hole. So there's a graph here from Europeana, the European Union's aggregator of digital cultural heritage. This was from a blog, I put the link down below, and they graphed all their content in Europeana from 1800 until today. And you can see how once you hit the 1920s, things start to decline, and especially from the 1950s onwards, there's hardly any content in Europeana which is from the 20th century. That is caused by copyright and the fear of copyright, as well as the actuality of copyright. We have the problem of orphan works. A lot of cultural heritage, we can't trace who the copyright owner is or the IP owner is. A lot of these things are ephemeral, and we just don't know. They might be very interesting objects, we just don't know how we would get permission. And this act of trying to seek permission and the fear of what will happen to us if we don't have permission for every last thing means that choices are being made about whole collections, about how difficult they are, and the choice is just made like, it's not really worth getting into it, rather than thinking institutionally how we can navigate this. And I've thought a lot about institutions and their risk appetite, and what we need to do as institutions to go, wait a minute, the choices we are making now, here, today, about that means that people can't study the post-war environment in the EU because we haven't digitised that stuff, because we're afraid that someone might come and sue us. We need to think about these ethical approaches and also the risk management that we're willing to take on about making sure that people can actually interrogate the modern world. So copyright's the biggie. But as well as copyright, there are privacy regulations, the general data protection regulations in the UK and across the EU, but there's similar ones throughout the world. There's IP, who gets to own the products of things that they've created and monetize them. There's also ethics. Just because something's legal to put online or digitize or share, it doesn't mean it's ethical to do that. And we're only starting to get our head around the frameworks which exist for very difficult histories, very contested histories, histories about abuse, histories about social movements which have dealt with a lot of hurt to certain sectors of our society. We need to be really careful about how we handle these in the digital environment and working and co-creating with communities about the choices that we make. And that's an extra layer of work beyond GDPR and beyond IPR, and we're only starting to get our head. There's a rush to digitize everything, but all online, it'll all be fine. Turns out it's not all fine, and it can actually be revisiting sources of violence. We have to be very careful about that, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that. Digital humanities, library and information studies really need to focus on that. And then there's business models. So that is how we monetize all this stuff, how we can take this stuff and actually make some profit out of it. Now, there'll be some people in the audience recoiling at that thought. What, you know, there's various values which exist about digital cultural heritage. The thought that we might be able to digitize stuff, put it out there for free, and other people make money off it. Some people believe that that's okay, some people don't. But at the same time, there are things that other people could be doing with digital cultural heritage that we might allow them to do if we can't think of how we are going to do that. For example, at the moment in Edinburgh, we're working on a project on this. We're working with artificial intelligence. We're working with colleagues who are taking content from the National Library of Scotland, and they're figuring out how to point AI at it to make new artworks, which they're selling as NFTs. So there is means to trial of digital cultural heritage, how it fits into a whole that framework. We need to work through how that's best rolled out across the sector so that everybody's happy. And that's a real research area, especially around NFTs at the moment. Another thing that we need to really figure out is how best to analyse collections at scale. So this is taking collections as data, which is looking at, give me the whole content of a digitised collection, all 20 terabytes of it. Allow me to put it onto a high performance computing unit. Allow me to analyse it at scale so that I can look at things, trends, various ways that technology has been used, or various ways that people have appeared, or various ways that ethical issues have changed over time at scale over a mass content. We have to figure out how to turn digitised images into data. I've already mentioned handwritten text recognition to transcribers, but there's also things that can be done with AI. For example, the geoparser that we have at Edinburgh, which is looks over any text and it figures out from that a mention of a word, which is a place, and then it gives a lat long, so a latitude and longitude, which allows you to map it, and it can differentiate because of the context what places we're talking about, whether we're talking about Kirkcaldy in Fife in Scotland or Kirkcaldy in Australia. So we can then map things and understand things and interrogate data better. So there's ways of analysing this. We need to do work on that and work on these approaches, working with the likes of our natural language processing people or our image processing people to do things like handwriting recognition technology. So we need to work with the computational sciences there. So there's tools and techniques and approaches that need to be developed, working in collaboration with folks on things like AI, linked data, text and data mining. And there's also aspects about understanding catalogues, understanding whole collections, being able to visualise your whole library catalogue, and how you spot biases. Biases is a hot topic just now in digital humanities, how we can actually spot cataloguing biases within collections that will be affecting our outputs before we even start. I'm working with a PhD student just now called Lucy Havens, and she's looking at biases in archival metadata descriptions and how we use natural language processing to interrogate that. And we're working on the whole of the University of Edinburgh catalogue when we're doing that. So it's, you know, this is very live work, very new work, and we're, you know, we've not published much on that yet, 1 or 2 papers, but Lucy's happy through our PhD, we're making good progress. And there's questions about engagement, users, social media. How best do we share all this stuff once it's digitised? How best can we provide digital culture heritage once we've spent the resources into making a copy of things? There's no such thing as the public. There are many different audiences. We need to understand the way that we are delivering things, our own blog analysis of our own websites. We need to understand our own social media and our distributed channels. We need to think about institutional voice. We need to think about the opportunities that are there. We need to think about the risks which are involved. Digital humanities and library and information studies can help study, compare and contrast all this and make recommendations for particular individuals, institutions, and to make sure that people are really pushing the envelope and keeping up. It's so hard to keep up in this space. It changes so often, so quickly, and we as a sector don't have the resources to keep up in the same way. So actually reaching out, especially student projects, so we've had a lot of very good student projects in this space and making recommendations for different institutions about how they use social media and user engagement best in a rapidly changing environment. Okay, let's think about teaching and how we can get digitisation put into both digital humanities and I'm going to say library and information studies teaching. Very few LIS schools in the UK anyway have a digitisation unit. I know that because I built one when I was at UCL, and we actually had a digitisation unit which was separate to the commercial digitisation unit for digitisation of collections, but where we taught students they got to experiment with the technology. So that's a picture of one of my students who did give permission to use this picture of her, actually learning how to use a book radio and how to do best practice, following best practice guidelines. So our students need to actually get hands-on practice of the digitisation processes. They need to look at the technical aspects. They need to look at the application of digitisation. They also need to understand the theory behind it. And this is important not only for library and archive collections. The same processes are being used to digitise all our legal histories and our medical records just now, as well as business records. Digitisation is a process which has biases built in and has issues about data management. We need to train up the next generation of people holistically to be able to understand that, to go out into the world and help make sure that digitisation is done at high quality. It's not as easy as pointing your digital phone at stuff and just taking a picture. So there are these practical skills which are needed, but then we have the quantitative skills that I've already referred to apply methods to analyse the collections. And there are also qualitative skills, things like interviews, surveys, user experience, and user analysis to be able to understand how to deliver things. And these are all the kinds of things that digital humanities and library courses can be teaching students to give them a holistic overview about the digitisation environment. But it's most important that this is done with teamwork. So the courses that I taught on digitisation when I was still at UCL in the library school, we did that with the library and archives alongside us and with the professional digitisation unit alongside us to make sure that we were all working together to give the students insights that they needed to be able to go out. One of my students, the first year we did the course, walked into a job at the British Library in the digitisation team. So we see that the students getting this training is really important, and a lot of the students who took this course have gone on to good things. And then just overall, I want to reflect on digitisation and digital humanities research and this need to make sure that we're doing it with librarians, with archivists, with curators. There's a lot of opportunities to engage with the digitisation process through the technology, through how it's being used, but we have to make sure that we have interdisciplinary project teams. We have to make sure that we're working with librarians, with archivists, with information professionals, not separate to them. And we also have to make sure that we're listening to librarians and archivists who know a lot more about a lot of different stuff than we do. And it's making sure that it's a two-way discussion about how best to deploy digitisation within the culture heritage space. So the other aspect, which is how you make sure that people find this. A lot of digital, or find the research that you've actually taken the time and invested in doing. A lot of digital humanities folks publish only in digital humanities venues, a lot of which are behind paywalls. But if we want people to find out about this wonderful research we're doing, interrogating the digitised environment, making recommendations about how best to do it, then we really need to be publishing and presenting in venues that our librarian colleagues will see, like VALA, or we need to be taking it out to different venues or publishing in different venues to make sure that we're talking about this in the round and not staying within our digital humanities burrow. So it's really important that we try and think in an interdisciplinary manner, but also how and where we're publishing about this. In that way, we can make sure that our findings reach out to a wider audience, and we can help build a better digital scholarship landscape together, because this is about digitisation that feeds into the overall digital scholarship landscape and allows people to interrogate it. So we need to work with our library colleagues. The Digital Humanities need to work very closely with our library and GLAM colleagues, because digitisation is not a separate bounded activity. It drives and it allows a lot of digital humanities research, and when we can work together and inform best practice and the choices about digitisation, the teaching can train individuals with digital skills which can contribute not only to the GLAM sector but to wider industry, and we can all learn a huge amount from each other, and it really depends on this work together that we will do. Let me see, my screen's just frozen again. Let me see if I can, there we go. So I was going to now round up a few things that we've been doing at the University of Edinburgh to show you how we're walking the talk in this space. I work very closely with colleagues in the library and the digital imaging unit. This is the report from a year and a bit ago. We don't have last year's one because of, COVID. So we digitise, University of Edinburgh, we digitise about 70,000 things a year, 70,000 images. We also have a service where people can ask for things to be digitised and delivered to them if they can't get into the library. That, of course, has changed massively during COVID. We have a lot of views online of people using stuff for research. We are doing more and more student engagement, student placements. I'm about to host 2 PhD students from my centre will be hosted as student internships, learning about the digitisation process. There was a digital wall that was put up allowing lots of different digital interactions, and we're now starting to look strategically at the collections that we are digitising and choosing which ones we then want to do further research on. For example, we have the catalogue, or we have the whole, half of the library of the philosopher and economist Adam Smith, which was bequeathed to the University of Edinburgh Library, and we have 850 books. So firstly, we had to catalogue that. Then we've looked to see which ones of those hadn't been digitised elsewhere, or the specific editions hadn't been digitised elsewhere, so that then we could choose the list of those that we should digitise, and then we did a collections assessment to make sure how we're going to get things digitised. So we're at that process now where we're thinking about digitising the whole of Adam Smith's library so we can do data mining on it. So we can then look to see how having that library at the University of Edinburgh affected people using those texts and where these texts ended up elsewhere, for example, in the PhD collections. And that depends then on having the entire PhD thesis collection digitised from the 17th century onwards. So yeah, we've got there. Last year we finished the PhD thesis digitisation collection, and we're now mounting that as what we call collections as data. So there's a whole data set that we can take and do text and data mining on. We also have the statistical accounts of Scotland, which is a very important record of Scotland, and we're now doing some mining of that against things like Encyclopedia Britannica and the newspapers such as the Scotsman, which we have bought. We bought the digital records for that, the digitised versions of that, so that we can mine it against our digitised collections, and thinking about how we can use text and data mining to interrogate these different collections. And to do that, we need high performance computing. You can't do this kind of stuff on your own computer. It would take forever. So we're working very closely with the Edinburgh Parallel Computing Centre, EPCC. We've built an infrastructure where we can ingest text, we can mine it. And the idea of that is that researchers do a lot of the heavy lifting on the Parallel Computing Centre's racks, and then they get delivered back a subset of data, which they can then interrogate on their own machines, whether that's making maps or whether it is actually sitting and reading through every example of something that you found in this mass data set. So it's finding out that sweet spot between researchers and high performance computing in the arts and humanities, which is very few people in the arts and humanities use high performance computing. So we're trying to make it easier for people to get access to do the things that computers do well, which is search through masses of haystacks for needles, deliver the needles back to people who can then organize them and do whatever you want to do with the stack of needles. And a lot of my work just now is supporting the arts and humanities community at Edinburgh and trying to get more people to ask big questions of our digitised past. What does that mean? How do they do it? What's best practice? How do we support people? And to do that, then, you need to provide a lot of training. My main day job is director of something called the Centre for Data, Culture and Society at Edinburgh, which is a community of practice across a third of the University of Edinburgh, and trying to get more people using digital methods in their day-to-day research. That's across all of the arts, humanities and social sciences. So to do that, we have to support people, but we also have to train them. We've set up various training pathways: data visualization, statistical analysis, managing digitized documents, and we have within that individual courses that we run that people can take in their own time. These are not for credit, these are not courses where you get a certificate at the end. This is the kind of stuff building up your own research skills, so people can dip in and out. Overall, we provided 85 different courses last term, including ones that people can do or skip out on and take at different levels. And we also repeat these at different times, depending. We work quite in an agile manner, so if things sell out very quickly, we run things again. This is, by training people, this is changing the research environment at Edinburgh, because we're trying to respond in an agile way. Within a month or two, if people say, I really need an update course on GitHub, we use our PhD students to do training. We, of course, pay them, but we make sure that we are using our research environment and the people who are actually researching to deliver these short courses. We do it in an agile way. We're really trying to upskill 1,300 academics and 10,000 students in digital methods to try and do more with digital. And especially over the pandemic, it's been more important to make sure that people are getting the most of digital content and the most of digitized content. So I think that's about what I have to say today. It's a fairly rapid run through about a lot of stuff. I hope I've managed to persuade you that there is a relationship between the digital humanities and the computational analysis of the past and the act of digitisation. The process, the average process, the usual routine process is now known about how you would digitise something. But the digital humanities use the products of this process for teaching, for research and engagement. We're also influenced by what we can do because of the choices made about this process. And the digital humanities really must engage with digitisation and the library and information science sector to help create inclusive digital GLAM collections for the digital humanities and beyond. It has been an absolute joy to talk to you today. I hope that's been useful, and I can share the slides if anyone wants to look at any of the links that I've provided there. I hope you have a marvellous conference, and I really hope to be able to come and visit you at some other time. Take care.